Welcome to Elizabeth's Chronicles. If you love true crime stories like this one, consider subscribing. Bobby Dunbar was born to Percy and Leslie Dunbar, an influential family living in Opelousas, Louisiana. He was 4 years old, and had a younger brother, Alonzo. On August 23, 1912, the family decided to take their children on a trip to Swayze Lake. Despite the name, Swayze Lake isn't actually a lake. The lake is actually nothing more than a swamp that's infested with alligators. Bobby, who was 4 years old at the time, snuck away from his parents' tent and wandered off towards the bayou. He seemed to have vanished into thin air. Was he taken by someone? Did the worst thing imaginable happen, that he was eaten by alligators? Those were the questions that would grip two families for generations. When the boy's parents realized their son was missing, they were devastated. This began an 8-month-long search for their son. Mrs. Dunbar was overwhelmed with grief. When it was discovered that the boy was missing, a search traced him to the banks of Lake Swayze. In the beginning, it was feared that he had drowned, but the lake was searched extensively and no body was found. Later, the little boy's cap was found some distance from the lake a day or so later, leading them to speculate that something else may have happened. The entire town grieved with the Dunbars' tragedy. A $6,000 reward, around $160,000 today, led to a flurry of sightings of blonde, blue-eyed boys. 8 months later, a boy was found matching the description of Bobby Dunbar, with a man named William Cantwell Walters of Mississippi. Walters denied the boy was the missing Bobby Dunbar. Instead, he claimed the boy was Bruce Anderson, and he had the permission of the boy's mother, Julia Anderson. He claimed the boy was the illegitimate child of his brother and their servant. Walters claimed that the boy was actually Charles Bruce Anderson, generally referred to as Bruce. He said that the boy's mother had willingly allowed the boy to travel with him. Julia Anderson would later confirm this. Nonetheless, Walters was arrested and authorities sent for the Dunbars to travel to Mississippi, and attempt to identify the boy. Newspaper accounts vary with regard to the initial reaction between the boy and Leslie Dunbar. One account stated that the boy immediately shouted "Mother" upon seeing her, and the two then hugged. Another newspaper stated that the boy cried and quoted that Leslie Dunbar said that she was unsure whether he was her son. While other newspaper accounts quote both the Dunbars as initially stating doubts as to the boy's identity. There were similar accounts in newspapers of the Dunbars' younger son, Alonzo, not recognizing his supposed own brother, while another newspaper claimed that the boy recognized Alonzo instantly, called him by name and kissed him. The next day, after bathing the boy, Leslie Dunbar said she positively identified his moles and scars and was then certain that he was her son. The boy returned to Opelousas with the Dunbars. A parade, with much fanfare, celebrated the boy's homecoming. Not long after, Julia Anderson of North Carolina arrived to support Walters' claim that the boy was, in fact, her son, Bruce. Anderson was unmarried and worked as a field hand for Walters' family. She stated that she had allowed Walters to take her son for what was supposed to be a trip for 2 days to visit one of Walters' relatives. She further asserted that she did not consent for Walters to take her son for more than a few days. According to newspaper accounts, Anderson was presented with a lineup of 5 different boys. All who were of the same approximate age as her son, including the boy who had been claimed by the Dunbars. When the boy in question was presented, he reportedly gave no indication that he recognized her as his mother. She claimed she was unsure it was in fact her son or not. The next day, upon seeing him again, when she was allowed to undress him, she was able to say with certainty that the boy was indeed her son Bruce. However, word had already spread that she failed to positively identify him on the first attempt. This, in addition to the fact that newspapers questioned her moral character in having had 3 children out of wedlock, led to Anderson's claims being dismissed. Anderson had no money for court battles, so she returned home to North Carolina. She later returned to Louisiana for Walter's kidnapping trial to testify to his innocence and ask for the court to determine that the boy was in fact her child. At the trial, she befriended many of the residents of the town of Poplarville, Mississippi, many of whom had also come to proclaim Walter's innocence. William Walters and the boy in question had spent quite a bit of time in Poplarville while traveling, and the people there had come to know them well, with many of them testifying that they had seen Walters with the boy prior to the disappearance of Bobby Dunbar. Despite their claims, the court ruled that the boy was in fact Bobby Dunbar. Walters was convicted of kidnapping, while the boy remained in the custody of the Dunbar family, and lived out the remainder of his life as Bobby Dunbar. After the trial, Anderson stayed in Poplarville and eventually married, and had 7 children. According to her descendants, she became a devout Christian, helped found a church. She became a nurse and midwife to the small community. Although her children indicated that she led a happy life, after settling in Poplarville, they said that she spoke often of her lost son, and that their family always regarded him as having been kidnapped by the Dunbars. After serving 2 years for kidnapping, Walter's attorney was successful in appealing the conviction and he was granted the right to a new trial. After the excessive costs of the first trial, prosecutors in Opelousas refused to try him again and instead released him. Walters died on April 7, 1945, and was buried in Pueblo, Colorado, beside his wife. The boy raised as Bobby Dunbar married, had 4 children of his own and died on March 8, 1966. He was buried in Opelousas, Louisiana. His wife died in 1994 and was buried next to her husband. Bobby Dunbar grew up and worked as a salesman for Briggs Electrical Supply. He married and fathered 4 children and never questioned his place in the family. Many years after Bobby Dunbar's death, one of his granddaughters, Margaret Dunbar Cutright, began her own investigation into the events, reading through newspapers, interviewing the children of Julia Anderson, and reviewing the notes and evidence presented by Walter's attorney for his kidnapping trial and appeal. Although Cutright had initially hoped to find evidence that her grandfather was a Dunbar, her research ultimately led to doubts. In 2004, after a press reporter approached the family about the story, Bob Dunbar Jr. consented to a DNA tests to resolve the issue. The results showed that Dunbar Jr. was not blood related to the Dunbars. Since the DNA testing is conclusive, the fate of the real Bobby Dunbar remains unknown. The DNA test, for some brought closure, for others it only raised more questions. What actually happened to 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar at Swayze Lake, back in 1912? Was his fate that of a tragic encounter with an alligator? Furthermore, it appears an innocent man spent 2 years in prison, for a crime he did not commit. And a young child was taken from his biological family, and lived out his life in the place of another child, leaving the true mother without her son. Did the Dunbars really not notice that this was not their son? Or were they so grief-stricken that they accepted him as their son and did not question the obvious? Either way, a lot of people suffered from that fateful day in August of 1912. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing.